The party was in full swing, twinkling lights reflecting off raised glasses as lively conversations and laughter blended with the rhythm of the music. I stood apart, a practiced smile fixed on my face, clutching a glass of wine like it was my last lifeline. While everyone else celebrated, something inside me teetered on the edge of collapse. It was impossible to ignore. She was dancing with him, not just dancing but sharing a connection that spoke volumes. Lingering glances, hands that held on a moment too long. Each movement felt like a knife twisting deeper. The place I had fought so hard to claim beside her over the years now seemed like a distant memory. I could have pretended not to see it, but the truth was I already knew. This wasn't a slip or a moment of weakness. It was a pattern, a choice she had made again and again. And tonight, in front of everyone, it felt like she was rubbing it in my face. "Why don't you dance with your wife?" someone quipped with a playful smile, likely trying to be friendly. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh. "She looks busy," I replied, bile rising in my throat as I turned away from the scene that tortured me. But I wouldn't look away for long. Something in that moment, a repressed anger, a craving for justice, took hold of me. This wasn't about saving our marriage anymore. It wasn't even about her. It was about me, about finally freeing myself from the weight of something she had destroyed. She laughed as the music shifted, and they continued to twirl as if they were the stars of some romantic scene. Maybe they were, at least in her mind. But in that moment, something inside me shattered. It wasn't sadness or despair, it was raw, burning determination. I strode to the center of the hall, my mind buzzing with the words I was about to speak, words I knew would change everything. "I want to make an announcement," my voice echoed through the room, cutting through the hum of conversation until silence fell like a heavy curtain. She stopped dancing, her eyes locking onto mine with confusion and faint fear. Her lover tried to slip away unnoticed, but it was too late. The damage was done. All eyes were on me now, and I could feel the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. "This will be the last party we attend as husband and wife," I said, my voice firmer than I expected, slicing through the silence like a blade. "I'm asking for a divorce." I paused, letting the words sink in before adding, "And let me be clear, this decision is a direct result of the choices she has made." The room erupted into murmurs and gasps. She stood frozen, her lips trembling as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Her lover shifted uncomfortably, trying to edge toward the exit, but every step he took seemed to draw attention like a spotlight. "No," she finally cried out, rushing toward me. "Please don't do this here, not like this." Her voice cracked with desperation, but I saw it for what it was. Not regret for what she'd done, but fear of public humiliation. "Enough," I said coldly, cutting her off. "No more lies. No more excuses. I spent years pretending not to see, years ignoring deleted messages, flimsy excuses, schedules that didn't add up. But today you made it clear who you are." She shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake. I know that. But we can fix this, we can—" "No," I interrupted sharply, my voice rising. "I've already fixed everything I can. I tried harder than you deserved. But tonight? You danced your last dance while still using my name." The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with shock and morbid curiosity from those around us. But for the first time in years, I felt in control. What no one there knew was that this wasn't just about asking for a divorce. For weeks, I had been preparing for this moment, consulting lawyers, transferring assets, organizing my exit flawlessly. Every penny she thought she'd have access to was gone within days. The shares, the house, everything was protected. And while she would have to start from scratch just as I would, there was one key difference. I would walk away with my dignity intact. As I left the hall, her sobs echoing behind me, I knew this was only the beginning of what lay ahead. What would she do when she realized she had nothing left? When she understood that her betrayal had cost her not just our marriage but the life she had built? The thought made me pause for a moment. I turned back briefly and saw her surrounded by friends who looked just as stunned as she did. Something in her expression told me she still didn't grasp how deep this blow would go. And me? I couldn't wait to see it all unfold. After all, the dance had only just begun. Richard watched Emily from across the room as she greeted guests, her smile flawless. He knew better. Over the years, Emily had perfected the art of masking her emotions, but recently Richard sensed a subtle shift, an intangible distance between them that lingered like a faint shadow. It was there, unspoken yet undeniable. The party was meant to be a celebration, a testament to their shared success and unity. Yet, as Richard swirled his wine glass, his unease deepened. His eyes followed Emily's every move. She was captivating as always. From the moment they'd met, he'd been drawn to her magnetic presence, the way she could light up a room with effortless charm. But beneath that radiant exterior lay a woman who rarely let anyone in completely, not even him. He knew she carried expectations he often failed to meet, not for lack of effort but because she seemed to yearn for something more elusive, something he couldn't quite grasp. Emily, too, wrestled with her own struggles. Richard was everything she could have asked for in a partner: reliable, stable, devoted to their family. Yet the predictability of their life had begun to suffocate her. Each day felt like a carbon copy of the last, and she longed for something undefined, something beyond the carefully curated life they had built. She loved Richard, that much was certain. But love alone wasn't always enough to fill the voids life created. As she moved through the crowd, Emily felt Richard's gaze on her. She turned and met his eyes, offering a practiced smile. Inside, though, a tightness gripped her chest. She knew he felt the distance too. There was an unspoken guilt between them, a quiet acknowledgement that somewhere along the way, she had fallen short of matching his unwavering dedication. The party unfolded with elegance, every detail meticulously planned to impress. Guests exchanged pleasantries about business trips and trivialities that filled their glamorous lives. Richard mingled with investors, but his attention kept drifting back to Emily. Her laughter rang out like a melody above the hum of conversation. She was still the woman he'd fallen in love with, yet there was something about her growing detachment that gnawed at him. Richard prided himself on being pragmatic. He believed problems could be solved if you found their root and worked toward a solution. But this silent disconnection, was unlike anything he'd faced before. It felt like fine sand slipping through his fingers, impossible to hold on to or fix. Emily used the party as a distraction. Every conversation, every smile helped mask the doubts swirling inside her. At times, her mind wandered to the past, to who she had been before becoming Richard's wife, before the expectations and routines took over. She had once been full of dreams of her own, dreams that now seemed lost in the shuffle of their carefully curated life. As the evening wore on, the music grew louder and the invisible barriers between them seemed to harden further. Richard watched her with a mix of love and frustration as she became increasingly absorbed in her own world. Yet there was something in her eyes, a melancholy she tried to hide, that caught his attention. "Is everything all right?" he asked when they finally found a moment alone. His voice was low but carried a weight that demanded an answer. Emily hesitated before replying with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said lightly. "Why wouldn't I be?" Richard saw through it immediately, the empty smile, the deflection, but he chose not to press her just then. There would be time for that later. The rest of the evening passed in slow motion for Richard. Every laugh, every toast, every movement Emily made seemed loaded with hidden meaning. He felt like an outsider in a game where he didn't know the rules, and though he hated to admit it, he feared what might lie behind her growing detachment. When the party ended with smiles and warm goodbyes, Emily thanked their guests while Richard stood silently beside her. The weight of his suspicions grew heavier with each passing moment. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he sensed that sooner or later the truth would come to light, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, their routine continued as usual, impeccable on the surface but hollow beneath it all. To outsiders, they were still the model couple, successful, harmonious, but within their luxurious home lingered a deafening silence. Conversations once spontaneous were now reduced to trivialities. Every gesture felt calculated, as if they were both tiptoeing around an inevitable confrontation. Richard wasn't blind. He noticed Emily's furtive glances at her phone and the vague smiles that seemed to appear without explanation. He noticed how often she made excuses for events that never seemed to include him. Dinners with friends, work meetings, harmless get-togethers. "Nothing you need to worry about," she would say whenever he asked. But Richard did worry, and more than that, he grew suspicious. One day, these mysterious outings left Richard unsettled. Though his mind resisted the possibility, he decided to confront the evidence head-on. He moved through the rooms of their house as if searching for something tangible, a clue that might explain the growing disconnection between them. His search led him to their shared closet, where among neatly organized clothes he noticed a small suitcase that hadn't been used in years. Inside lay a parking ticket from a luxury hotel, a place Emily had never mentioned staying at. The ticket burned in his hands as questions swirled in his mind. But he couldn't bring himself to confront her, not yet. Instead, he chose to observe quietly, piecing together fragments before unleashing chaos. The following days were tense and silent as Richard scrutinized every detail, every gesture and excuse Emily made. Slowly but surely, Richard began connecting the dots until suspicion hardened into certainty. Mere hunches weren't enough. He needed the truth no matter how brutal it might be, and he was determined to uncover it. Emily carried on with her usual routine, seemingly unfazed by Richard's watchful gaze. She appeared calm, almost indifferent, as though her excuses were enough to mask whatever she was hiding. But Richard didn't miss the fleeting glimpses of guilt in her eyes, moments when her carefully constructed facade cracked. Then came the night of the party. It was a grand affair, designed to bring together friends and business partners. A celebration meant to symbolize the stability and success Richard valued so deeply. He saw it as the perfect opportunity to observe Emily in her social element, to see how she behaved when she thought no one was watching. Somehow, he sensed this would be the night everything came to light. The party began as any other. Richard mingled among the guests, exchanging smiles and pleasantries, while Emily played the role of hostess with practiced ease. But he never let her out of his sight. His eyes tracked her every move, every glance she exchanged, every smile that lingered a moment too long. And then he saw him, a tall, confident man approaching Emily with an air of familiarity that set Richard's nerves on edge. The handshake, the lingering gaze, Emily's smile, it all carried a weight Richard couldn't ignore. He watched from a distance, his mind wrestling against the conclusions that seemed inevitable. When the music started, Emily and the man took to the dance floor. It was an elegant dance, but there was something more, something that transcended social conventions. Their gestures were too intimate, their gazes too deep. Richard felt his blood boil but held himself back. He knew an explosion was coming, but not here, not now. Stepping outside into the garden for a moment of respite, Richard tried to steady his racing heart and chaotic thoughts. He needed clarity. He needed certainty. And most of all, he needed to decide how to handle what was unfolding. When he returned to the hall, his resolve hardened. He spotted Emily and the man in a far corner, speaking intently. Though he couldn't hear their words, their closeness spoke volumes. A lump formed in Richard's throat, but he remained composed. This would be the last time he allowed Emily to deceive him. The dance continued, but Richard could no longer ignore what was right before his eyes. He moved closer, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection. He watched their gestures, their whispers, their smiles. Everything he had feared was laid bare. Emily was no longer the woman he thought he knew. Betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was undeniable reality. Taking a deep breath, Richard felt the weight of every decision looming before him. He knew his life would change forever, but there was no room for doubt now. He made his way to the center of the hall where the music still played and raised his voice above the din. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said firmly, his tone charged with emotion. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him, including Emily's. Her expression was a mix of surprise and apprehension. Richard knew this was the turning point, the moment everything would change forever. As he looked at Emily, he realized that beyond the devastation of betrayal lay something deeper, something he didn't yet fully understand but would soon confront head-on. The hall grew unnaturally quiet, as if everyone held their breath at once. Richard stood motionless, his gaze locked on Emily, who for the first time that night seemed truly lost for words. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. The man beside her took a step back as though trying to disappear into the crowd now watching with equal intensity. What had once been a vibrant celebration had turned into an uncomfortable spectacle of stares and judgment. "You think I didn't know?" Richard's voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade, calm but carrying an undeniable force that thickened the air around them. Emily took a hesitant step forward and raised her hand as if pleading with him to stop. "Richard, please, not here," she murmured weakly. But it was too late for restraint. "Why not here?" Richard countered coldly as his voice rose slightly in volume without losing its composure entirely. Each word struck harder than any shout could have done alone. "Why not let everyone see who you really are? I spent years believing in us, defending you against everything while—" Richard took a deep breath, struggling to control the anger rising like a tide within him. "While you did it behind my back," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Emily looked around, desperately seeking support in the faces of her friends, but all she found were expressions of shock and curiosity. There was no refuge, only Richard, exposing every crack in the facade she had tried so hard to maintain. "I didn't mean it to be like this," Emily finally replied, her voice low and almost inaudible. "I never meant to hurt you." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Of course not. You just wanted to do it away from my eyes so I could keep living in this illusion, didn't you? This isn't about sparing me, Emily. This is about you not wanting to deal with the consequences of your choices. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Emily lowered her eyes, unable to bear the weight of Richard's gaze. It was a mistake, she whispered, almost pleading. I didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling. And now you do? He retorted, his tone icy. Because I know. I know exactly what I'm going to do. Just then something shifted. The intensity in Richard's gaze seemed to diminish, replaced by something colder, more calculated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. The room seemed to hold its breath as Richard slowly opened it. His voice, controlled and dangerously calm, cut through the silence like steel slicing through air. Let me show you what happens when trust is broken. This, Richard began, his voice steady but laced with venom, is proof that you were never truly on my side, Emily. You didn't just destroy our marriage, you tried to dismantle everything I built. He pulled a stack of papers from his jacket and held them up, the crisp edges catching the light. Emily's eyes widened in recognition. She took a step back as though the words on those pages were arrows aimed at her heart. You didn't think I'd find out, did you? His gaze swept the room, cold and calculating. While you claimed you needed time, you were quietly signing contracts with lawyers to take half my company. You thought I was blind. You thought I was a fool. Emily opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her carefully constructed mask crumbled, revealing raw panic beneath. She reached out to him, but Richard stepped back, his expression unyielding. Please, she finally managed, her voice trembling. Let me explain. It wasn't what you think. Not what I think? Richard laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and devoid of warmth. You were planning to leave me, Emily? All while playing the devoted wife. But I wasn't as naive as you believed. I've been preparing for this for weeks. He turned to the guests, his voice rising with conviction. I knew about the betrayal. I knew about the lover. His eyes locked onto the man standing beside Emily, who paled under the weight of Richard's accusation. And now everyone here knows. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd, but no one dared to speak. Richard turned back to Emily, his eyes a storm of sorrow and resolve. You wanted control. You wanted to take everything from me. But I did what I should have done long ago, I protected what was mine. He tossed the documents onto the nearest table with finality. You'll have nothing, Emily. Not the house. Not the company. Not my respect. Emily collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as her composure shattered. I made a mistake, she choked out, her voice breaking. But I loved you, Richard. I always loved you. He studied her for a moment, his expression hardening like steel. Maybe you did, once. But that doesn't matter now. Because today, Emily, I finally see who you really are. And you're going to learn what it means to lose everything. The hall fell into stunned silence as Richard walked away, his footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor. Emily remained on her knees, her broken figure a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. The air was heavy with unspoken truths. This was only the beginning of her reckoning. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Richard stepped outside into the rain, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed him into the night. The downpour mirrored the chaos he left behind, a fitting backdrop to his shattered world. He walked aimlessly, the weight of betrayal pressing heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just his marriage that had crumbled, it was trust, respect, everything he had once believed unshakable. Meanwhile, Emily knelt in the center of the hall, her hands trembling and her mind reeling. The guests lingered awkwardly, unsure whether to offer comfort or slip away unnoticed. Her gaze lifted to her lover standing a few meters away, his face a mask of guilt and helplessness. Aren't you going to say anything? She asked hoarsely. He hesitated before replying quietly, What do you want me to say? You knew this could happen, you knew it was a risk. His words struck like a blow, undeniable and brutal. Hearing them now only deepened her despair. Emily rose slowly and approached him on unsteady feet. I thought you were by my side, she said softly, her voice laced with hurt. I was, he replied without meeting her eyes before adding firmly yet regretfully, but this has gone too far. I can't stay here now. Before she could plead or protest further, he turned and disappeared into the dispersing crowd, leaving behind only silence where hope had once stood. Hours later, Richard sat alone in the dimly lit study, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. On the table beside him lay a neatly organized stack of papers illuminated by the warm glow of the firelight. Outside, rain continued to fall steadily, washing away remnants of the tumultuous evening. Here sat a man grappling silently with inner turmoil, wrestling emotions that threatened to overwhelm him yet determined to push forward despite the pain gnawing relentlessly at his chest. Richard tried to focus on plotting his next move, but images of Emily kneeling in the hallway invaded his thoughts relentlessly. There was something in that moment, something deeper than guilt or shame, that he couldn't quite decipher. The sound of the front door opening snapped him from his reverie. He stood quickly, he knew who it was. Emily entered, drenched from the rain, her face pale and eyes swollen from crying. She hesitated in the hallway before approaching him as though carrying an unbearable weight. "I know you don't want to see me," she began shakily, "but I had to come. I had to try to explain." Richard crossed his arms. His expression remained cold and unyielding. "Explain what? That you destroyed everything? That you deceived me at every turn?" "I'm not here to defend myself," she replied softly but firmly, shaking head slightly before continuing. "There are things which remain unknown, things which need saying." He laughed bitterly. "Oh, of course there are. But will any of that change the fact that you betrayed me? That you tried to destroy everything we had?" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "I know it won't. But I need you to understand, I didn't do it because I stopped loving you. I did it because I was afraid." "Afraid?" Richard raised an eyebrow, his voice sharp. "Afraid of what? Success? Stability? What more could you possibly want?" "Afraid of losing myself," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It sounds absurd now, but I felt suffocated, Richard. Not because of anything you did, but because I didn't know who I was anymore. Everything felt like it was slipping out of my control. And then, when I met him, it felt like an escape. I know it was selfish, but at the time it seemed like the only way." Richard fell silent, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. He wanted to feel rage, to lash out, but instead, a heavy exhaustion settled over him. "And what did you think would happen, Emily?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "Did you really believe destroying everything we built would make you happy? That it would give you some kind of peace?" She hesitated, then took a step closer, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know what I expected," she admitted quietly. "But what I do know is that there's nothing left now, and it's all my fault." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. Finally, Emily broke the stillness. "I know I've lost you, Richard. I know I've lost everything. But if there's anything I can do, anything to try and make this right, I will." He studied her for a long moment, his emotions torn between anger and something softer he refused to name. But there was one thing she still didn't fully grasp. "Do you want to fix this?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Then start by accepting that there's no going back. You can't undo what's been done. But maybe we can figure out how we got here." She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." Richard exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with pain and difficult questions neither of them wanted to face. But as the rain tapped softly against the windows, he decided to take the first step. Not for her, not even for them, but for himself. Because despite everything, he needed closure, even if it meant starting over. The rain continued its steady rhythm outside as Richard sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy and unyielding. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall, marking time with cruel precision. Emily sat across from him, her eyes fixed on the floor as she twisted her hands nervously. Neither seemed to know how to move forward after their earlier confrontation. Richard felt an overwhelming exhaustion, not just physical but emotional, as though every word spoken that night had chipped away at him. He leaned back on the sofa and stared into the fireplace, watching the flames dance like echoes of the chaos in his mind. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know what happens now." Richard kept his eyes on the fire as he replied, "I'd like answers too, but honestly, Emily, I don't have them all right now." She stood and began pacing slowly as if movement could untangle the thoughts swirling in her head. "You don't owe me forgiveness, not now, maybe never, but we can't keep living like this, with this uncertainty hanging over us." He turned toward her, bitterness sharpening his tone. "This silence is all that's left after everything else has been stripped away. Do you have any idea how much effort went into building our life together?" She stopped mid-step, tears threatening to spill as she answered, "Yes, yes, and yes again. My actions tore apart everything we built together." A humorless laugh escaped him. "So now you shift the blame onto shoulders already carrying too much?" Her voice softened but held firm. No one person bears all the responsibility. We ignored the signs, the growing distance between us. Richard stared at her for a long moment, grappling with her words. Deep down, he knew there was truth in what she said. Their marriage hadn't collapsed overnight. It had been eroding for years, small cracks widening until they became irreparable. Still, accepting that reality felt impossible. "You still don't understand," he said finally, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "No matter how bad things were between us, you chose to betray me. You chose to lie. That choice, it's yours alone." Emily nodded silently, her eyes downcast. "I know," she whispered. "And I'll pay for it, Richard. I already am." The weight of their conversation left them both drained as the night stretched on endlessly. Richard retreated to the kitchen for a glass of water, hoping to clear his head. Standing by the window, he watched the rain fall relentlessly outside and felt something unfamiliar, not anger or sadness but a hollow emptiness. When he returned to the living room, Emily was still there, but something about her posture struck him differently now. She seemed smaller somehow, fragile in a way he had never seen before. For the first time that night, Richard grasped the full scope of their shared devastation. It wasn't just him who was shattered, Emily was too. "What now, Emily?" he asked, his voice softer, almost resigned. "What do you really want?" She met his gaze, and for a moment he saw raw honesty in her eyes. "I want to understand what went wrong," she said quietly. "I want to try to make things right, even if it doesn't mean saving us. I don't want you to hate me forever." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Hate doesn't fix anything," he said. "But neither does trying to mend what's beyond repair. Maybe the best thing we can do is move on, separately." His words lingered in the air, final and heavy with sorrow. Emily nodded slowly, as if she had already known this was the only answer. Yet hearing it from the man she once loved felt like one last wound to her heart. "I'll pack my things," she whispered. "I'll leave in the morning." Richard simply nodded, silent. Words felt hollow now, incapable of changing what had been decided. As Emily climbed the stairs, Richard sank onto the sofa, engulfed by a loneliness he hadn't known before. Yet somewhere deep inside he sensed this emptiness was just the beginning, a necessary step to rebuild his life from the ground up. The next morning brought a different kind of silence, no longer charged with tension or unspoken arguments. It was the quiet of acceptance, the acknowledgement that everything had irrevocably changed. Richard rose before dawn and retreated to his office. He needed to organize his thoughts and map out a way forward. As he shuffled papers on his desk, he heard the faint creak of Emily descending the stairs. She carried a small suitcase and wore simple clothes, stripped of her usual elegance. She looked diminished, fragile. When their eyes met, neither spoke immediately. It was as if all their words had been spent. "I'm leaving," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "I won't trouble you anymore." Richard nodded. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words felt adequate. Relief and sadness tangled within him, leaving him unsure of what he truly felt. Emily hesitated at the door as if waiting for him to call her back. But he didn't. She stepped out quietly and the door clicked shut behind her. Richard stood motionless, listening to the sound of her car fading into the distance. That was it, the end of a story he had once believed would last forever. In the days that followed, Richard buried himself in work. Keeping his mind occupied was his only defense against the emptiness threatening to consume him. Yet there was a newfound clarity about him now, a sharpness that hadn't existed before. He wasn't just rebuilding, he was learning. The betrayal had shattered him, but it had also revealed truths about himself, about what he would tolerate, and what he would never allow again. Meanwhile, Emily faced a different journey, one without the comfort of their shared home or the stability Richard had provided. She was forced to confront the reasons she had destroyed something so precious. She began therapy, something she had long avoided, and slowly unearthed old wounds that had never healed. It was painful but necessary. Months passed and the distance between them grew, not just physical but emotional. Richard started attending social events again after years of self-imposed isolation. At one such gathering, he met Claire, a woman whose straightforwardness and optimism brought a lightness he hadn't realized he needed. She was different from Emily in every way, uncomplicated, grounded, with a vision of life that inspired him to be better. What began as friendship gradually deepened into something more. For the first time in years, Richard felt hope. Emily, on the other hand, faced the stark reality of her new life without Richard's financial support. She started from scratch, taking a job at a small company and renting a modest apartment. It wasn't the life she was used to, but there was an unexpected freedom in it, a chance to stand on her own and find value in things she had once overlooked. Fate had one final twist in store for them both. A year later, Richard and Emily crossed paths by chance in a coffee shop. The encounter was awkward yet tinged with nostalgia. They exchanged polite greetings, and Emily noticed how different Richard seemed, more at ease, happier than she remembered. The moment lingered in their minds long after they parted ways, a quiet reminder of what they had lost and what they had gained along their separate paths. "You look well," she said with a shy smile. "I am," he replied sincerely. "And you?" She hesitated but answered honestly. "I'm still figuring things out, but I think I'm on the right track." There was a pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both recognized that their painful past had led them to places where they could finally find peace. When they said goodbye, there were no promises to stay in touch or attempts to reclaim what was lost, just an unspoken understanding that this chapter needed to close. Richard returned to his life with Claire, building something solid rooted in trust and respect. Emily continued her journey, finding small joys in her newfound independence. Both had learned that confronting their own demons was essential before blaming each other for their failures. This wasn't just a story about betrayal, it was about growth, resilience, and finding peace after loss. This is a story about choices, consequences, and the painful yet necessary journey to find oneself. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of this story? Share your reflections in the comments below and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next impactful narratives we bring your way. Remember, this channel does not condone betrayal. Our goal is to explore how such choices can unravel lives and relationships. Until next time.